Hi folks, it's good to hear from you again. Today we are going to talk about interpersonal violence and ignored populations, specifically elder populations and disabled populations, or people with disabilities, whichever language system you subscribe to. So let's get started. So first we'll talk about elder abuse. Some of the basics are that elder abuse wasn't actually really researched or studied until the 1970s when it was first described in the medical literature. Now this doesn't mean that elder abuse wasn't perpetrated until then, it was just never described until then. It's more difficult to define than other forms of abuse, partially because the definitions of elder vary, and so we don't know if elder abuse starts at 60 or 65 or 55 or 80. Definitions of elder vary by institution, by person, by abuser, by elder, so that makes it difficult. Another difficulty in defining elder abuse is that the definition of abuse may not be the same. So people who are elderly are more susceptible to things that people who are younger aren't, and so we might not define it as abuse if it were against somebody in their 20s, but it might be abuse if it's somebody in their 80s who is the victim. Elder abuse commonly includes similar forms of abuse as abuse among younger populations. However, elders are more susceptible to financial exploitation and neglect than are people of younger ages. The prevalence of elder abuse is similar across types of abuse and across institutions who have done research. They put it at roughly 8 to 10%. Like youth violence or like violence against children, underreporting is a big issue. So only 1.4% of elder abuse was reported to Adult Protective Services, which means that there's a lot more violence going on out there that we don't know about, which is an issue. It affects roughly 1 million elderly people every year in the United States. So a lot of people are being affected by this. It's an underreported type of violence, and it's kind of difficult to ascertain whether or not it's abuse or not all the time. Sometimes it's pretty clear, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult, especially if the person who is being abused doesn't report it or doesn't know that they're being abused or doesn't know where they can turn to for assistance. Perpetrators are most often family members. The abuse is most often found at home. You do see abuse in nursing homes or other sort of institutional facilities, but more often than not, the abuse is at home with a family member. Elders that are mistreated or maltreated are 3.1 times more likely to die in the 3 years following than are elders who are not maltreated. So there is a pretty severe consequence to abuse among elderly folks. This table highlights some of the types of abuse. This source is provided in the notes if you'd like to read the rest of the paper. It is pretty interesting, but there are some different forms. So there's abandonment, there's emotional abuse. Again, there's financial exploitation, which elders are more susceptible to than our younger folk. There's also two I want to highlight. So the first is self-neglect, which I just circled in red, and that's somebody's refusal or failure to care for themselves. We don't really see that as much in younger folks, just because we are perhaps more able or are more interested in caring for ourselves than our elderly folks. Another I want to highlight is resident-to-resident aggression. Again, we don't see this as much among younger folks because younger folks aren't in nursing homes. They aren't in institutions. So this is negative interactions between residents in nursing homes or care homes that are more exclusive to elder populations. Some risk factors for elder abuse include being young old, so being in your 60s where you're kind of at the younger age of elderly gives you more of a risk factor because then you're more likely to be living at home versus in a sort of an institutional setting. Women are more likely to be victimized than men, which is true across all ages. Women are more likely to be victimized than men are. Having a shared living environment, so living with family, living with spouses, etc., being low income and having an isolation or lack of social support similar to other populations. Particularly for financial abuse, there's been a documented correlation between dementia and a higher risk of financial abuse as well, potentially this is due to kind of just the mental faculties of the person who's being exploited. And poor physical health as well. So if that elderly person has poor physical health and they're being abused by their caregiver may feel caregiver burnout and feel the need to abuse them. Perpetrators are more often male with a history of substance abuse, which again is pretty common among all forms of interpersonal violence, I would say. They are more likely to be adult children or a spouse, or definitely more likely to be other family members as well. They also are more likely to suffer from poor mental or physical well-being, so they might have depression or behavioral disorders. They are more likely to be socially isolated and financially troubled or underemployed. They're more likely to have run-ins with police or run-ins with the law or have legal troubles. And they are more likely to be stressed. I talked about this idea of caregiver burnout, and so this is when the primary caregiver of an elderly person, particularly if they require a lot of special needs, becomes burnt out from caring for that person because they either don't have the resources, the finances, the time, the mental ability, the energy, whatever it may be, to care for that person. So they become stressed, they burn out, and this can lead to abuse because they feel the need to kind of assert their power and assert their dominance over that elderly person because they aren't feeling it themselves. Some consequences of elder abuse at the individual level include a higher risk of death. So again, those elder folks who are abused are more likely to subsequently die, which is highly unfortunate. They're also more likely to end up in nursing homes or hospital placements instead of, remaining at home with their abuser. And they also, excuse me, will suffer from poor mental well-being. At a community or social level, there are economic losses in the billions. And if you click the link, it takes you to a page that kind of describes just how much economic loss there is. And this is largely as a result of financial abuse. So elderly folk are more vulnerable to financial exploitation than our younger folk. If you've ever had, your grandparents talk to you about being emailed by, the Nigerian prince who offers to send them a bunch of money if they will just give him their bank account information. Things like that. Those of us who were raised with internet, who were raised with those kinds of scams, are a little bit less likely to take the bait. And older folks are more vulnerable. They're like, well, this seems like a good opportunity, and then they lose their money, which is it contributes to this large economic loss. So that's elder abuse in a nutshell. I encourage you to watch the videos I posted on the YouTube playlist and the readings that I have posted, both the required ones and the recommended ones, to kind of gain a larger picture of this very sort of understudied topic. But next, we're going to talk about abuse against disabled people. Now, these types of abuse definitely overlap, and they overlap with other forms of interpersonal violence as well. But I do want to kind of tease out abuse against disabled people in particular because we commonly think of disabled people as elderly, as infirm, as frail, 80-year-old grandmas with canes, which there are plenty of 80-year-old grandmas with canes. My great-grandmother was one of them. But disabled people can also be younger. They can be children. They can be 20-somethings. They can be, invisibly disabled or developmentally disabled, and not always disabled in a physical manner. And so their abuse is worth talking about as well. So again, looking at some of the basics, those with disabilities are 4 to 10 times more likely to be abused, according to the CDC. And 11.5% of adults with a disability have reported being victims of sexual assault versus about 4% of those without a disability. Now, research highlighting the prevalence of abuse against disabled people is actually relatively difficult to find, just because this is not an area that is commonly studied. Within criminology, we tend to focus on violence against women, police brutality, like those types of violence. And then in disability studies, they're not always talking about abuse. They're talking about accessibility, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and different, non-violence related. So those people who are disabled and they're victims of violence are kind of left out from both forums. A 2013 study, and it is cited in the notes, reports that over 70% of those with disabilities reported being victims of abuse. So that is a very high percentage of people. You don't see that in the general population. Common forms of abuse are listed there. Restraint may mean, left in the bed if they can't move, or restrained to their wheelchair. Their denial of rights might be denial of medication, of mobility aids, of accessible places, of help with, using the restroom, the denial of the right to explore their sexuality, other things like that. Non-quote-unquote traditional signs of abuse are common. So you might see disabled folks being victims of things like insurance fraud because disabled people aren't expected to go out and have a life. So risk factors and consequences similar to the prevalence of violence against disabled folks are relatively difficult to find, though not impossible. But being disabled in itself is a risk factor for being abused. And this is because disabled people are perceived as more vulnerable than are able people. So disability is a risk factor in itself. However, those with developmental disabilities may be more at risk than those with physical disabilities, just because their mental state is a little bit easier to be preyed upon. Having a lack of social support and being in an institution are also risk factors for being abused. Some consequences for victims, like consequences among other victims, include poor mental well-being and poor physical well-being if they don't already suffer from that or live with that. And the potential to develop comorbid disability. So if a person already has one disability and they experience some sort of abuse or trauma, there is a chance that they will develop a disability that's commonly found with that. So for instance, if you have an invisible disability such as lupus, you might develop fibromyalgia because they're comorbid with each other. I want to highlight in particular among abuse with those who are disabled, but also among elder abuse and other forms of abuse, that abuse in ignored populations really speaks to this idea of power. So the abuse among these populations stems from an assertion of power. For instance, between the carer and the individual, from adult child to elderly parent to caregiver to disabled person, there's this assertion of power. Abusive practices, however, may not be recognized as such, especially if they're subtle. So if, the disabled person is denied the opportunity to fully kind of live their lives, express their sexuality, go out and do things. They're always being told, well, wait your turn, we'll get to you, we'll get to you. It's a subtle form of abuse. It's not always recognized by either the victim or by the abuser. And this power stems from assumptions made about disabled people, from those attitudes and beliefs that we see on the lower level of the violence pyramid. I'm going to keep coming back to that. So some assumptions made is that difference is bad or inferior or devalued. And this is common among, I think, all forms of abuse, but particularly among abuse with disabled folks, just because their differences may be more obvious than others. Disability is without ability or dignity or pride. That's another assumption that is made. And so when they're being abused, it doesn't matter because they don't have dignity to begin with. Another assumption is that disabled people are incompetent to direct their own lives, so able people know what is best for disabled people. And if they're being abusive, it's just because it's for the disabled person's own good. We're just trying to help them. Another assumption is that individual value is measured by material worth and not personal existence. So in this country in particular, but in other sort of capitalist societies in general, we are measured by how much money we can make and how productive we are. So we're measured by how well we can work, how we can contribute to society in a quote-unquote meaningful manner, often meaning money, but sometimes also meaning social capital. And disabled people, if they're unable to contribute to society in those ways, are viewed as less valuable than other people. So their value is not measured by the fact that they exist. It's measured by how well they can be productive and how much they can be a meaningful contributor to a society. And if they can't, they're less valuable, and therefore we can be violent toward them, or we can, assert our power over them. So what we've learned to this point, and I'm going to continue to hammer this throughout the course because I think it's important, is that we know violence, or we've defined that violence removes agency by force. And force may be passive, such as, the denial of rights, or it may be active, such as, physical abuse. It upholds existing systems of power. And so those systems of power deem that people who are more privileged, such as white folks, men, straight folks, abled folks, younger folks, but not too young, they're not youth, middle-aged folks, are kind of at the top of this system of power, and everybody else is subsequently lower. And those that are at the top want to maintain that system because, they want to stay at the top. They want to keep winning. So they will resort to violence to do that. Not always explicit, but through maybe implicit biases, microaggressions, subtle acts. We've also learned that violence separates us, quote unquote, from them. So violence separates the savages from the civilized people. It separates the losers from the winners. It separates the inferior from the superior, and who we classify as inferior or superior or losers from winners kind of depends on who's in power and who's able to create laws and rules surrounding violence. So if you have questions, as always, you can email me. Next week we will continue our discussion or our chat on interpersonal violence, and we're going to look at gender-based violence and mass shootings and kind of how they relate not only to each other but to broader forms of violence, because then when we come back we'll talk about Unit 2. So I look forward to hearing from you if you have questions, and if not, enjoy your weekend.